Hello students, my name is Dr. Alice Mani. I will be imparting lessons on Business Law, course 306. I am the resource person for Mahatma Gandhi National Council of Rural Education. I will be imparting lessons on Business Law. This is part of the BBA Rural Management course. This unit, that is Chapter 3, is titled Sale of Goods Act 1930, and this will be covered in 4 modules. The first module will look at the basic features of the Sale of Goods Act 1930 and the types of goods. The second module will cover conditions and warranties. The third module will cover the rights of an unpaid seller. The fourth module will cover buyer's rights against the seller and duties of buyer. We will cover the fourth and last module of this unit, which is buyer's rights against the seller and duties of buyer in this video. So, let us go ahead and understand the topic in details. I have structured this lesson in the following way. This lesson will cover 2 broad topics. The first will be an introduction to buyer's rights against the seller. Second is duties of the buyer. The first module objective is to understand the buyer's rights against the seller. In the last video lesson, we have learned that unpaid seller's rights against the buyer. The Sale of Goods Act 1930 is giving certain rights against the other contracting party as a buyer and as a seller. The second objective is to equip with the duties of a buyer. This will help you to avoid mistakes while entering into contracts in our official and personal capacity. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand the buyer's rights against the seller and the duties of the buyer. Thus, you will get information about the legal consequences and rights and privileges of a buyer. This will be helpful for those who will become entrepreneurs in future or to understand the basic legal implications as consumers. This will equip us with the basic knowledge to be more alert and responsible in protecting our legal rights as consumers, seller, manufacturer, distributor, wholesaler, retailer, or as a buyer. Moreover, the knowledge about the rights of a buyer will guide us in entering the right transactions and not to get cheated either in the online or offline mode of purchase. So, let us understand this topic in details. Now, let us learn the topics in detail. The rights of a buyer against the seller are 9. They are right to have delivery of goods, right to reject goods, right to cancel the contract, right to claim damages for defective goods, right to examine the goods before purchase, right to sue for performance, right to insurance, right to sue for recovery of price, and right to claim interest for the delay. Let us learn these points in detail. The first right is the basic right of the buyer to take the delivery of goods from the seller after payment of consideration. The second right is the right to reject goods. And when to reject goods? If it's found that the seller has delivered him the goods of other quantity or quality, or if the buyer notices any defects in the goods, he may also refuse to take those defective goods. The third right is the right of the buyer to cancel the contract. If the seller does not perform his part in the stipulated time or otherwise, if the seller commits any negligence as to the performance of a contract. In that situation, it is the right of the buyer to cancel the contract. The fourth right is to cancel the contract if there is any defect in the goods which may cause loss to the buyer, or if due to the negligence of a seller. The buyer sustains loss in such circumstances or eventuality. It is the right of the buyer to be compensated, or the buyer can claim damages. The fifth right is the right of the buyer to examine the goods before its purchase and to duly satisfy himself as to the quality of goods. The sixth right is the right to sue the seller. If the seller refuses to obey the terms and conditions of the contract, which gives irreparable loss to the buyer, the buyer has to approach the competent court of law to compel the seller for specific performance. The seventh right is the right to take insurance if the seller believes that goods may be damaged in transit or transportation. Thus, it is the duty of the seller to give notice to the buyer if the seller delivers goods by sea route or by any other method, where the apprehension about the goods may be destroyed is there. Then it is the right of the buyer to insure the goods before its delivery. The eighth duty of the buyer is to sue for recovery of price from the seller. Thus, it is the right of the buyer to file a suit for recovery of the price which he has already paid to the seller. But even then, the seller refuses to deliver goods. The last and ninth duty of the buyer is to claim interest from the buyer. Thus, it is the right of the buyer to claim an interest in the situation if the delay is caused by the seller in the delivery of goods. Now, let us learn the next important topic, that is, the buyer's rights against the seller for breach of contract. There are 7 rights buyer is entitled to for breach of contract by the seller. That are: suit for damages, suit for price, suit for specific performance, suit for breach of warranty, suit for repudiation for breach of condition, suit for recovery of price with interest, and lastly, repudiation of the contract before the due date. Now, let us learn these rights in detail. The first right is the right to sue for damages. If the seller wrongfully neglects or refuses to deliver the goods to the buyer, then the buyer can sue the seller for damages for non-delivery. Now, what are the criteria for calculating damages? In this case, damages are calculated as contract price minus market price at that time when the goods ought to have been delivered. If no time was fixed, then at the time of refusal to deliver. There is an established case decision in this regard. In William Brothers versus E.T. Agnes, it happened in 1914. In this case, Mr. E.T. Agnes agreed to sell coal to Mr. William Brothers at the rate of Rs 160 per ton. At the time of delivery, Mr. Agnes refused to deliver coal to William Brothers because the price of coal was raised to Rs 230 pounds per ton. It was held that William Brothers can recover damages from Mr. Agnes at the rate of Rs 70 per ton. How this damage is calculated? This damage is calculated as the difference between market price and contract price. That is Rs 230 per ton minus Rs 160 per ton. The second right is the right for price. That is, if the buyer has paid the price before the delivery of goods, the buyer can recollect the price paid from the seller. The third right is suit for specific performance. The buyer got the right to sue for specific performance. This right is allowed if damages are not an adequate remedy for breach of contract. Say for example, if the contract is to paint a rare painting, then the buyer can ask for specific performance because damages will not compensate the buyer. The fourth is the right to suit for breach of warranty. Where there is breach of warranty by the seller or where the buyer decides or the buyer is compelled to treat the breach of condition as a breach of warranty, the buyer is entitled to file a suit for damages. If the price has already been paid, but if the buyer has not paid for the price, he may ask the seller for a reasonable reduction in price. The next right is the suit for repudiation of the contract for breach of condition. I hope you know the meaning of repudiation. It is rejected or cancelled. The breach of condition entitles the buyer to treat the contract cancelled. So the buyer is entitled to file a suit for cancellation of the contract. Conditions can be case specific to contracts. It can be with regard to date of supply, quality of goods, quantity of goods, place to deliver goods, special instructions regarding packing, the time of delivery and the time of delivery for the goods, etc. The next right of the buyer is with regard to recovery of the price with interest. Can you imagine when this right can be exercised? We might have come across similar situations in our daily dealings also. This right can be exercised by the buyer if he has already paid the price of goods to the seller but the goods are not delivered or if the goods are a stolen one. This is quite common these days. We get media reports about people selling mobile phones, cars, laptops and two-wheelers claiming that they are the real owners. An interesting case was reported in the media yesterday about a police inspector has stolen the mobile phone from the dead body of a youth died in an accident. The inspector, while completing investigating reports leading to the death, stole the mobile phone from the dead body. He had used his official SIM card in that phone and started using the mobile phone. Now he is under suspension. Thus, if the seller is giving a stolen item, claiming to be the owner, the buyer can sue the seller for the refund of the price along with interest. The interest can be claimed at a reasonable rate from the date of payment to the date of refund. The last right of the buyer against the seller for breach of contract is repudiation of the contract before the due date. This right is available to the buyer if the seller rejects the contract before the date of delivery. In this case, the buyer gets two rights. First right is the right to treat the contract as subsisting and wait till the date of delivery. Second right of the buyer is to treat the contract as rejected, then itself and then sue for damages for the breach of contract. This doctrine is known as the doctrine of anticipatory breach of contract. Now, let us learn the duties of the buyer in a contract of sale of goods. If the buyer is getting certain rights as per the Sale of Goods Act, there will be some duties for the buyer also. There are 9 duties to be fulfilled by the buyer in a contract of sale, that are duty to accept the goods and pay for them in exchange of possession, duty to apply for delivery, duty to demand delivery at a reasonable hour, duty to accept installment delivery and pay for it, duty to take risk of deterioration, duty to inform the seller if he rejects the goods, duty to take delivery, duty to pay the price and duty to pay damages for non-acceptance. Now, let us understand the duties of the buyer in detail. The first duty is to accept the goods and pay for them in exchange of possession of goods. This is an important duty of the buyer to accept the goods when it is delivered to at your address and pay for that. We know that if we order anything online, we have two options, either to pay cash on delivery or to make online payment. Now, due to COVID-19 pandemic, everybody is opting for online payment as consumers and not promoting cash on delivery. The second duty of the buyer is to apply for delivery of goods. In some contracts of sale of goods, the delivery slot also we have to decide and goods will be delivered to our registered address accordingly. If the delivery slot is not mentioned in the contract, the buyer can request the seller to deliver the item at a convenient time agreed upon by both the parties. We can select the delivery slot when ordering grocery, fish, meat or any other products online. If this option is not there, buyer can request the seller for delivering the item. This is an important duty of the buyer. The third duty of the buyer is to demand delivery at a reasonable hour. Now, what is reasonable hour? Do you have any idea about the same? I will tell you. Reasonable hours for a business are regular working hours. Usually, reasonable hour is decided as the time convenient, discussed and decided by both the parties. The next duty of the buyer is to accept the installment delivery and pay for it. Installment delivery is quite common in business transactions. If the buyer has agreed for installment delivery, it is his duty to accept installment delivery and pay for it. The next duty of the buyer is to take the risk of deterioration. The deterioration means the fall in the quantity of goods. This is true in the case of food items, especially if the contract is to supply sugar, jaggery or sweets, etc. Ants, rats or cockroaches may eat that if it is not stored or packed properly. This is the duty of the buyer if the seller is delivering the items as a special request from the buyer at a place other than where they are usually sold. If it is not in the seller's usual place of business, he may have special arrangements for storing the goods. But if the buyer is requesting for a special place for delivering the item, the buyer has a duty to accept the deterioration. The next duty of the buyer is to inform the seller if he rejects the goods. Unless otherwise agreed in the contract of sale of goods by the seller and buyer, if the buyer is not accepting the goods sent by seller, he has to inform then seller with the reason for rejection. The next duty of the buyer is to take delivery of goods sent by seller. The buyer has to accept the delivery of goods within a reasonable time. Otherwise, the buyer has to pay the seller for any loss caused due to his delay or neglect in accepting the goods. The next duty of the buyer is to pay the price. We know that in a contract of sale, ownership will pass from seller to buyer. If the ownership is passed to the buyer from the seller, it is the duty of the buyer to pay the price he has agreed to pay as per the terms of the contract. The last duty of the buyer is to pay for damages for non-acceptance. This duty will be applicable if the buyer refuses to accept the goods or pay for the same. Now the buyer has to pay the damages to the seller for non-acceptance of goods. Our learning wouldn't be complete if we don't assess what we have learned. So here I am giving one activity for you. Give a list of situations where breach of contract can take place, giving rights to the buyer against the seller. Now that we have reached the end of this lesson, I hope that you have learned the buyer's rights against the seller and the rights of buyer against the seller for breach of contract and the duties of the buyer. I hope that you got a good insight on the topics we discussed in this video lesson. To conclude, in this chapter of Sale of Goods Act, the first module we covered the basic features of Sale of Goods Act and the types of goods. In the second video lesson, we covered the conditions and warranties. In the third video lesson, we covered the rights of an unpaid seller. In the last module or the video lesson of this unit, which we covered now, we covered the duties and rights of the buyer. In the next video lesson, we will start with the last chapter, that is Consumer Protection Act 2019. Until we meet again, bye. Thank you.